Les voy a dar una semblanza muy breve del trabajo desarrollado por la doctora Laura Forlano al Illinois Institute of Technology, Institute of Design, es Assistant Professor of Design y también es miembro del College of Architecture, tiene el grado de doctora en Arquitectura y también del Yale Law School en el Information Society Project. De los proyectos actuales que está desarrollando la doctora Forlano, se encuentra el del Laboratorio de Críticas al Futuro, el cual se encarga del análisis de información sobre la forma en cómo materializar el mundo digital, conceptualizarlo e integrarlo a través de una variedad de escalas, incluyendo lo que puede denominarse como la infraestructura de las ciudades, todo el desarrollo de construcciones, objetos interactivos y elementos digitales. De la misma manera, están trabajando en lo que se denomina como tecnologías complejas, en lo ético, social y político, a través del desarrollo de prototipos, experimentos y la exploración que permita unir el creative thinking con el critical making. Y por último, el Driverless City, que está apoyado por el Illinois Institute of Technology a través del Nayer Prize, que es buscar la manera en cómo crear guías de diseño centradas en el usuario, centradas en los seres humanos, en escenarios sociales y técnicos que permitan dar solución a prototipos de infraestructura y a nuevos modelos urbanos y códigos urbanos que puedan permitir la transformación de las calles de las ciudades en algo novedoso para una infraestructura humana en el siglo XXI. Este último proyecto lo está llevando a cabo en colaboración con Marshall Brown, Lily Du, Ron Henderson y Jack Gutman. Bueno, sin más preámbulos, les pido un aplauso para dar la bienvenida a la doctora.
So, thank you very much for being here today. My name is Laura Forlano. I'm a social scientist, and I've been working in design departments and design schools for the past 10 years. My presentation is titled Making Critical More Than Human Urban Futures. And when I talk about more than human, I talk about both emerging technology as well as the natural environment and issues around sustainability and climate change. My presentation today will primarily focus on emerging technologies. And I want to be very clear from the beginning that the reason for showing you these examples around urban technology, mostly examples from North America, including Toronto, Chicago, and New York, is also a cautionary tale as to what kind of technologies are being developed and how we as citizens can reimagine cities with our values and our needs in the conversation, right? As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Design at IIT in Chicago. I know that there are a number of alumni connected with the university here and also leading well-known design firms in the area. And this year, I'm very fortunate to have some time off to focus on research and writing. And I'm currently at the Digital Life Institute at Cornell Tech as a visiting research fellow and at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University as a faculty associate. And so in addition to the long-term affiliation with the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. And all of these organizations that I mentioned have very active communities of scholars, lawyers, advocacy organizations, designers, and others that are working very hard to navigate how emerging technologies are being adopted into everyday life, into cities, and what should we do about it from a policy perspective and from an advocacy perspective. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Institute of Design, and I'm going to try to speak slowly today because I know that it helps me when I'm listening in Spanish. If the language is slower, I can understand better. So if I'm speaking too quickly, please just wave your hand, or if it's too quiet, please wave your hand so that I can adjust for your, so that you understand the maximum amount. So the Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, we were founded actually in the 1930s as the new Bauhaus School. And what does that mean? Well, important architects and designers, Mies van der Rohe and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, known from the German Bauhaus tradition, fled Germany and moved to Chicago and started new research programs where they brought their philosophy with them around cosmopolitan ideas, which were very much under attack in Germany at the time. And they came to the US and were allowed to, develop those academic programs, which are part of our intellectual legacy in Chicago at IIT. And because of that legacy and that history, over the past year, I've started a new project, which is a book project. It's called Bauhaus Futures, and the book will be published next year by MIT Press in 2019, which is the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, which was founded in 1919. And I'm co-editing this book with two colleagues, Molly Wright-Steenson at Carnegie Mellon University and Mike Anany at University of Southern California. And as part of this project, we've asked our contributors to write chapters about the topic of what would keep the Bauhaus up at night if it were practicing today. So by definition, this is not a historical project doing the history of the Bauhaus, but more of a jumping off and thinking about the future of the design field. So we want to use the history and think about the history and the relevance of the history, but we also have very powerful pieces which are also critiquing the history and talking about the way in which women or people of color were not a part of that legacy, and what can we do next in the field of design along those lines. And so I just wanted to point your attention to this project because it's a way for me and for the Institute of Design to reconnect with some of those conversations, but in a productive and generative way. So that tension between the critical scholarship and the generative ability to make things runs through all of my projects over the last 10 years. And that's something that I think is very, very needed in the field of design, is this ability to read theory, use concepts, and bring them more into our practice. And in the social sciences, there's also a great need to learn from designers about alternative ways of thinking, alternative ways of inquiring about the world, building knowledge, using visualizations, using prototypes, using storytelling, right? So I think that it can be a very productive relationship between design and the social sciences in that way. And so some of the projects I'll show have that ability built into them. So just a brief outline of the talk that I'll give today. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of the post-human and the more than human in the making of urban futures. I want to present 4 different smart city imaginaries. And so these are ways of bringing to you some of the sort of developments that have been happening in, as I said, North American cities, because those are my main research sites, but also ways of illustrating, what might go wrong, what are the problems with some of these interventions to date. And that's something I think is really important to discuss, many, many years before these devices are integrated into the city. We want to be having those debates and really bringing the citizen point of view into the conversation. And perhaps resisting those particular imaginaries and those ideas about what a city is, which are being presented by government and sort of technology. Then, as part of that conversation, I will talk a little bit about the Driverless City project and show you a video from that project. And then second, the Made in Chicago project. I'll talk a little bit about that one. So one of the driving questions in much of the research I've been doing over the last 10 years is really, how do you study people, things, and societies that don't exist yet? Okay, so I very much think about emerging technologies, so things that are not yet embedded into everyday life, so that I can understand what our politics are, what our societies are, what our cultures are, and try to use those framings and imaginaries that are being presented and try to then make arguments for what we should do or what kind of generative way can designers engage. So in many ways, just as I mentioned the relevance of the Bauhaus to so much of the world that we experience today, we are still living through, a period of these kind of cybernetic dreams. So a lot of the technology, computer science and artificial intelligence and machine learning, a lot of the things that we hear about today, that path was set in the 1940s and the 1950s. And we're just now sort of seeing examples in everyday life that are really kind of bringing that narrative back into the conversation. And it's been going on for many, many years, but I think we're in a moment where some of those claims are really heightened and where some of those dreams are also realities. And where some of the things that we can do as designers in terms of reframing requires a deep knowledge of some of these histories of technology, which you could go back to the cybernetic scholarship. So if we just look at what are the kinds of urban futures that are presented to us, for example, in science fiction movies, here's a sort of range. Often these science fiction movies seem to be set in cities in East Asia, like Tokyo or Shanghai, right? This is a very common trope in science fiction to see these kind of kanji characters or Japanese characters, for example, Chinese characters, for example, as well. And so I think that is part of what's building the imaginaries of what we're living today is what we're presented in sort of science fiction narratives. And hey, I love science fiction movies too. So there's something very appealing about these narratives, clearly. But there's also often some warnings or some dystopic aspects, right? And I heard yesterday a number of the talks brought up like utopias and dystopias and how can we work meaningfully at the intersection or have some nuance to really talk about the politics of those futures, right? So here's an example from Blade Runner 2046, or from Ghost in the Shell, or from the movie Black Panther. How many people might have seen the movie Black Panther? Show of hands. Okay, so some of you. I think what was exciting about the movie Black Panther was that it presented a very technologically advanced society that also maintained cultures and traditions, and it presented them together in a very kind of coherent narrative, rather than some examples which are, everything is very high tech, but there's no remnant of kind of human culture or right? So sometimes technology ends up replacing some of the cultural traditions. So I think Black Panther made a lot of impact in the United States in terms of attracting audiences from diverse backgrounds, and really, playing with imaginaries in a unique way. And I teach a course at ID called Designing Futures, and we had a week where we just discussed Black Panther and Afrofuturism and sort of what were the productive aspects and what were the problematic aspects of this, this vision. So I've done a little bit of writing around this topic in an article called Invisible Algorithms, Invisible Politics. And some of the examples that I discuss in that article I will share with you today. Here's an example just from everyday mainstream news press, how Google created the least offensive design ever. So they claim that they have tested 150 shades of the color gray to develop the Mini, which is an in-home assistant similar to Amazon's Alexa. And just the fact that 150 shades of the color gray were tested precisely to figure out which is the one that most people would be attracted to or would fit in most people's houses. I think it says something about the way that technology companies are thinking about the aesthetic possibilities for the environment and for space and for interiors, right? And personally, I don't really agree with their model, right? This A/B testing of 150 shades of the color gray. And why the color gray? So there are lots of things we could discuss just in that simple example of how technology companies are driven to verify and have evidence for the choices that they make and what they think the optimal, the least offensive design, for example, is. So some of the questions that I'm very curious about and interested in is, how can the field of design shape technology? So that's more the human-computer interaction field in some sense. But more and more, a wider variety of designers are likely to be involved in the design of technology-related products. And especially industrial design for everyday products and architecture and environmental design. Not to mention interaction design and designing websites, but also how is technology shaping design? What are the aesthetics that are emerging when technology companies are playing such a big role in designing our everyday experience? And what are the aesthetics and politics at that intersection? So one of my favorite books growing up was called The Phantom Toe Booth. Maybe some of you have heard of this book. It was written by Norton Juster, who I believe was trained as an architect. And in that book, children's book and also film, there's a character named Alec Bing, who you can see there floating. And he has a famous statement, which is, "It's all in how you look at things." So I find that to be a very useful phrase because with my background in the social sciences, the way that I use theory greatly shapes the way that I look at things. And I try to communicate to design students that having different theories and concepts can really greatly change the way that you look at things and the way you approach design. Another example from the book is actually a house, and there's Milo, the central character, and then there's sort of a man that comes out of the house. And on one side of the house, it says, for example, the thin man, and on the other hand, it says the fat man, but it's the same man. So it just shows how framing can greatly influence what you see, right? So in my approach to design, I really find that we need to be thinking across disciplines, across scales, across different modes or methodologies or formats, and we have to think about across the human and non-human, which is a discussion that's been coming up, for the last several decades, but we're really in a moment where we can take advantage of that. And so we really, design research has failed to redesign itself. So we actually have to redesign design before we can redesign the world with new methodologies of design, new conceptual approaches to design. And, this is kind of, you could say, design for the post-industrial economy, but for the moment that we are now. So moving from studying things to studying broad socio-technical systems and processes. Thinking about emerging technologies, thinking about new understandings of what it means to be human with emerging technologies or even with our relationships to the natural environment, and how does design construct models and frameworks around the user and human needs. So we really need to be transforming those ideas. So I talk a lot about the need to reconfigure the user. I mean, some people just hate the word user and they just never want to say it at all. And so to the extent that we can reinvent that language, that may also be helpful. I mentioned non-human users, which includes, again, emerging technology and the natural environment, but we also think of non-users, people who reject technology, who don't want to use it. Human-centered design has focused so much on the user that sometimes we forget that there are people that don't care at all about whatever it is you're designing. So maybe we can learn from those people as well. We have to start to take into consideration multiple subjectivities and identities and what's known as intersectionality. So this idea that gender and race and disability and all of those things that make you who you are also impact, your ability to navigate the world, navigate urban cities, right? And so we have to think more about this term of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law professor in 1989. And human-centered design has very much privileged the individual user, and of course there are other approaches to design that are more participatory and collaborative. And certainly this is a moment where we can think more about those collaborative modes and approaches where the designer is actually allowing others to design. And I think we saw some examples yesterday of those kinds of processes. And in this case, users become participants themselves. We might also take some attention to emerging conversations around maintenance and repair and care, which are conversations that are relevant, I think, to a wide variety of topics. And so instead of design continually focusing on designing the new things and innovation, we can think about the role of both ourselves as designers as well as users themselves having to repair things. And that is a different kind of relationship, right, with products or with your neighborhood, right? So it's a more active role, and it's one that really needs to consider resources and sustainability. So overall, I talk about my research program or many of the projects I've done under this idea of the Critical Futures Lab and designing critical futures to bring together, to pick up on many conversations around critical making and critical design and orient towards critical futures. And here, I have just kind of a list of some of the key concepts that are important when we think about designing critical futures. Design really is about building knowledge, first and foremost, which means raising questions. We think a lot about using prototypes and experiments and interventions, and thinking more about values and social justice and feminist approaches and what's being called right now decolonial design or design justice. So if we think about design in that way of knowledge building, that means that we really need to draw on a wide variety of theoretical concepts in order to do that work, and we need to figure out what can design contribute to the expansion of our understanding of knowledge. And so here's Liz Sanders' well-known chart, and it points out, some of the main traditions in the field of design, speaking from the human design tradition, human-centered design. And, one of the arguments I would make is that we really need to start working across all of these different design approaches. So at the moment, it's difficult to get an education in all of these types of designing. Typically, if you're in human-centered design, you would be there in that left-hand corner. So you'd be there. And then if you're at sort of an art school, you'd be doing more critical and speculative design and using cultural probes, for example. And then here of course, in Scandinavia, they have a long tradition of participatory design research. And so we see examples of these, of course, all around the world in different faculties and departments. And we really need to be thinking about how can we provide a design education that allows students to get exposed to a wide range of approaches, some of which we used to call art, and some of which we used to call engineering, or some we used to call some part of architecture, right? And I think each field kind of, has a different way of mixing these things. But certainly from the perspective of a human-centered design school, where we've focused mainly on the methods of human-centered design, we are, through some of the classes that I've been teaching, trying to integrate some of the speculative and the artistic and the futures-oriented work, just because it's one of the many things that we need designers to be able to be conversant in and have a point of view about. So when I talk about criticality and the concepts and the theories, I mainly I'm talking about these kinds of ideas, and I'll touch on them briefly. I'm primarily drawing on science and technology studies as a field, which is a very interdisciplinary field, but it's primarily a social science field that involves many sociologists and anthropologists that study science, laboratories, emerging technologies, and they have, they're known to be quite abstract and difficult to understand concepts, but on the other hand, quite useful, I think, for the field of design. But we're still kind of bringing those two conversations together. And there's actually a recent journal publication, Revista de Diseño, out of Chile, where they did a whole special issue just on these conversations across science and technology studies and design. So there are places where the dots are being connected, and where people are making some of those arguments. I mentioned, of course, the post-human and more than human, failure, breakdown, maintenance, care, and repair. So these are just broad areas of study topics within science and technology studies that are useful for this conversation. I'm going to skip a few things here. So, here's an example of a concept that's been around for almost 30 years. Donna Haraway's concept of the cyborg and her well-known piece, The Cyborg Manifesto. And, in it, she makes the claim that we need to start thinking relationally about these concepts. So instead of thinking about the separation between some of these categories, which, for hundreds of years have dominated at least Western scholarship, from the Enlightenment on, the separation of nature from culture, the separation of human from non-human, we need to start coming up with new ideas and new concepts that are able to connect these. So when you see this slash, it means that these are connections that we should be focusing on. We have to create new language and new dialogue that connects these. And so the cyborg is just one example. It's a human, non-human combination. And what she does is she takes the early cybernetic cyborg, which is primarily about extending the capabilities of humans, and she reappropriates it, repurposes it for her own, intervention into scholarship. And it's been a very influential article. It's very difficult to read, but it's also very powerful when you start thinking about the ways in which you're in your everyday life, not only in scholarship, but these separations have been made so clear. And I think yesterday's presentation was one example where we had architecture that showed kind of boundaries and separations, and then the ability to reconnect with the horizontals and verticals. That was so interesting, right? So I think that, if you start looking it through the lens, or if you start looking with the eyes of the cyborg, things will start looking different for you too. So try to, in your everyday life, as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, going out into the world and making some notes about where you're seeing the separations and where there are possibility for relations and connections. So there are a couple of recent books which I'll point to, which help us understand how can design really use theory, and how do we make design theory, as Johan Redström from the Umeå University in Sweden says. He gives us 3 examples of ways that we can combine theory with design. He calls them parallels, sequencing, and intermediaries. And I would refer you to his book for more details. But what he basically makes the claim that in most design projects, theory is an input, but then once the design starts happening, we rarely go back to the theory to see well, what did we add to the theory? What did we add to the concept? And that's what he's arguing, that we have different ideas that we can mix together concepts and the generative work of design in new and different ways, and be more careful and deliberate about how we do that. And we're not really sure what should theory look like in design. It probably should look different than in other fields, but at the same point, I think he makes it's a very important to keep that in mind. In another book on design research through practice, Thomas Marcuson talks about building theory through design, and he here gives a couple of different examples. He says that we can extend theories, so essentially adding something to an existing body of theory. We can scaffold theories, so sort of finding different theories and building on one another, or we can blend theories. And I think blending theories is probably the most common form of theory construction. At least if you look at some of the computer-human interaction conferences, it's very, very common to introduce a new concept to that field and sort of show how does it apply in that field. So you're combining computer-human interaction with some new idea or theory, and then you name that, and that becomes a new concept or idea that you offer to the field. I've had some experience with that. I don't attend that conference, but I wrote a paper called Decentering the Human in the Design of Collaborative Cities, and that paper has gotten cited a lot in the computer-human interaction community. And so what I've seen is that one idea, which builds on many, many, many social science papers, can add a lot to some of the conversations that are happening in that computer-human interaction or CHI community. And so there's a book that came out a few years ago on design anthropology, and I think that design anthropology is a place where they are really trying to figure out, what does design offer to the social sciences and what do the social sciences offer to design. And there are some examples of new approaches like speculative ethnography or sensory ethnography that are trying to really think about social science research as a generative practice, not only as a descriptive practice where we explain what is the world about, but how can it be, in a sense, more like design as a generative practice. So I'm going to move on to some discussions about the future and the post-human. So ideas about the future are everywhere. We constantly see the word future invoked in advertising and in branding, and in particular in smart city projects. So this is a van that was parked outside of the University of Michigan driverless test bed. So it's a place where you can test autonomous vehicles. So here's the brand is like connecting the future. Or one of my field sites where I've been collaborating with folks around smart textiles, the Brooklyn Fashion Design Accelerator, their tagline is "Make the Future Here." Or at the UI Labs in Chicago, which is a digital manufacturing space, "The Future Today." So these tropes and fantasies about the future are absolutely omnipresent. I'm sure that you could leave this auditorium and in the afternoon just go walking around in Mexico City, and I would imagine, although the contexts are completely different, we might find some comparative, points of data that would show that the future is often invoked to sell us things, to make us, optimistic and hopeful about what's happening next, right? There are lots of reasons why we invoke these ideas. So futures, it's really important to use, again, like multiple and pluralistic perspectives. So one of the arguments about the future is that science and technology and economic progress are usually presented to us as a linear, deterministic path towards the future in which there's no alternative. We must upgrade to the latest iPhone because this is, the thing to do, right? It's equated with progress, our ability to participate in the future. So it seems like there's only one choice. But we know, of course, that there are many choices. But a lot of those other pathways are just not presented. They're not imagined. The people who have those ideas are not included in the process, right? So it's probably familiar to you. And I think, around speculative futures, the one book that probably gets the most attention is the Dunn and Raby Speculative Everything book, which presents to us, the possible, plausible, and probable futures, and then within that, the preferable futures. And so this using design to ask questions and to offer possible futures, and that approach is one which is still, I would say, considered to be more of an art practice, and rather than a human-centered design practice. One very funny example, which I urge you to go watch later today, is a video about Brad the Needy Toaster, and this was created by a group called Addicted Products. And it's more or less an artistic intervention into a conversation around sharing economies. And so the idea is that this toaster, if you don't use it enough, it will leave you and find a new home. So the whole video is presented as, a critique of human wastefulness, the fact that we have a power drill at home and we only use it 12 minutes in its lifetime, I think was a famous quote from John Thakara's book from 2005, the book In the Bubble. So, it's a critique of our own problematic consumption of many, many devices that then break down and then we throw them away. And it's told in a very humorous story about this character, Brad the Toaster. So that might give you an example of what is speculative design all about. So moving on a little bit to theories of the posthuman, I said here that the most important thing is that despite the fact that it comes from a wide body of different scholarly approaches, from what's called actor network theory to feminist new materialism to speculative realism and object-oriented ontology and non-representational geography and transhumanism. Like, these are all very different bodies of literature. These scholars may not get along. They might actually really hate each other, but there's a similarity in how they are arguing for concepts and notions of the posthuman. And then you have to kind of read to figure out, well, what exactly are they trying to claim about that? But I think one thing that is in common is these relational ideas and the way that we need to move away from those dualistic approaches that I presented on the cyborg slide and towards relational approaches. So that's one commonality here. And if you want to read a little bit more and get some additional reading lists, I've published 2 papers in which you get an outline of these fields and get an idea of some of the designers that are currently working with these ideas of the post-human and the more than human. So what if we were to ask, instead of thinking about the human-centered world that we've been designing for and human needs, what if we were to ask what a chicken wants? Okay, so there's an example from an Atlantic article where they talk about the company Purdue Chicken, and it's provocatively titled What a Chicken Wants. And, they do talk about how would we study chickens if that was our object of design, right? So they talk about needing, animal behavior experts and doing observations and thinking about, what are the design skills that would be needed to study bacteria or fungus or biotech or chickens, right? It's a new capabilities of design that we would need to answer the question. Now, why is Purdue asking that question? We could probably be more critical, right? They want to sell more chicken, and their consumers were very upset and angry because of claims, around whether or not the chicken was fed, high quality food, right? So we could still decide, is this a good application of design to answer that question for Purdue? But at the same token, the point remains that we as a design field need to find new ways of answering such questions. Or what if we were to ask, what algorithms want, as Ed Finn provocatively asks in his recent book on imagination in the age of computing. Or Joanna Zolinska's book, she asks, really from this book, a non-human photography. So it's all images that are taken by a small camera, which just experiences the world in a very different way. So just looking at those images, you get a very different idea of what the world is about than one from the perspective of ourselves, the human. So some of the key questions that I ask in the Posthumanism and Design article are who or what, and I list human and non-human, human and animal, individual and network. Who or what are the users, and for whom or what should design be desirable? How and in what ways are capabilities, agencies, and power distributed across humans, machines, and natural systems? So this is a very classic science and technology studies question. How are the agencies distributed? So when I'm using this microphone, is it an extension of me, or what agency does it have? Well, the agency of this microphone is that in order to use it, I have to hold my arm in a certain way. Or one of the famous examples of Bruno Latour, a French theorist, who talks about the seatbelt, the automated seatbelt, and how someone who has an automated seatbelt cannot choose not to use the seatbelt because it's been programmed into the car that you must use a seatbelt. So that's a great example, and it may not exist, of course, in all contexts, but it's an example of how a rule or law in a certain context would be actually designed into a technology, okay? So, what new knowledge, questions, stakeholders, and partnerships are needed to design for these problems, and how are ethics, values, and responsibilities reflected through these design processes? And I would add social and economic justice and those conversations I mentioned around decolonizing design and design justice, which I think are very emergent conversations as well in the field of design. So there's already been lots of design conferences in which these key questions about, who we are as humans have been asked. So for example, the third Istanbul Design Biennial, which seems to attract, I would say, or be curated by more of an architectural design field, but asked this question, are we human? And published 2 books that went along with that. And so with that, I'm going to close this section around new concepts and new ways of thinking about design through the post-human and the more than human, and move on to some of the empirical examples of the kinds of emerging technology that we need to critique and think about and maybe design. So within this, there are 4 overall categories that I'm thinking about, and they are not mutually exclusive. They blend together in some ways, but this is just my way of trying to organize and name and discuss what is at stake when we start integrating emerging technologies into cities. All right, so this idea of a city as a platform, the city as a test bed, the city as a lab, and the city as a new urban factory. I would say these are 4 common frames that come up again and again, depending on which example you're looking at. And I like to think about this concept of patchwork, which was introduced to me by colleagues in Scandinavia, Usa Stahl and Christina Lindstrom, who wrote about this in their PhD thesis. This idea of a patchwork, what's interesting about it from the perspective of this study are that, we can both think about needlework and textures and textiles and sewing, but we can also think about computing, a small piece of code inserted into a program to improve its functioning or to correct an error. So it has a really nice play on words for the purpose of thinking about both how are cities coming together as the product of sort of top-down, bottom-up, and many other kinds of activities, and that computational aspect along with that craft aspect. So here I'm going to present a few examples of new projects in, again, North American cities in which we can really have some of these discussions. So first, there's a kind of a framing that is taking hold in these conversations. And it's really this idea of the city from the internet up, okay? So this example is actually Hudson Yards. You can, screen grab this from their website. It is a new development in New York City and Manhattan on the west side in the 30s, very close to the historical garment district, fashion industry, and textile hub. And it's being, it was, much of it was quite empty aside from rail yards, and it's being taken over and redeveloped into this Hudson Yards property. You can see that it's talked about in their own kind of public relations as the biggest private real estate development in U.S. history. It's a very tall building as well. They're very fancy buildings with celebrity chefs. So it's a very luxury, high-end property with department stores and this kind of thing. And here's a picture that I took myself about 2 years ago near that property. Now it's much more advanced. And the next example I'll talk about is Sidewalk Labs, which is a new waterfront development in Toronto. And so, this neighborhood from the internet up, as it's being called by Sidewalk Labs, is currently being developed in cities around the world. And Sidewalk's own project in Toronto, where the company is planning to incorporate smart energy grids, sensors, noise and pollution monitors, adaptive traffic lights, as well as a host of autonomous and self-driving transportation and delivery vehicles. Similarly, Bill Gates recently purchased 24,000 acres of land in Arizona, where a technologically advanced city called Belmont is being developed. Also, Facebook has been developing a property called Willow Village near their headquarters in Menlo Park. So according to the New York Times, Facebook is testing the proposition, do people love tech companies so much that they will live inside of them? Do people love technology companies so much that they will live inside of them? Can you believe it? So when the project was announced last summer, critics dubbed it as Facebookville, or in tribute to company co-founder Mark Zuckerberg, Zucktown. The next example is from General Electric. And General Electric is working with L-Star Ventures, the developer of planned communities, to build Union Point, which is located 12 miles south of Boston. And they're primarily looking at smart grid and smart energy technologies. And Amazon, of course, is soon going to announce their own new headquarters in the United States or Canada, potentially, I think. And that city will be the test bed for the latest in transportation, logistics, and delivery. And so cities around the country right now in the United States are competing to get Amazon, to attract Amazon to come and build another headquarters there. Okay. So in the city as platform framing that I mentioned, people are considered one of 4 asset classes that the cities must leverage. In some ways, we could say citizens are reduced to eyeballs or their data. And these companies are often able to negotiate different agreements in different cities. So they have a lot of power to negotiate the terms. And not all cities are able to resist or negotiate better conditions. So here's an example. This is what's called Link NYC. These are terminals that you see on the streets of New York. Here's another example. And so in early 2016, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio agreed to shut down the internet browser on the city's new Link NYC kiosks after only 7 months due to complaints over people loitering around them for hours, listening to loud music, watching movies, viewing pornography, and surrounding them with furniture. Can you believe it? So people were really building like little encampments around the Link NYC terminals because, hey, they wanted to watch videos and pornography and do what they wanted to do, right? So ironically, the city had to turn off the internet access on the screen itself and only allow you to use it, on your phone with the Wi-Fi. So these kiosks are intended to replace the over 7,500 payphones, and they're run by a consortium of companies called CityBridge, and that provides free Wi-Fi phone calls, real-time maps, and access to the 311 services, which is the non-emergency services, as well as 911, which is the emergency services, in exchange for targeted location-based advertising revenue. So if you think about what happens if you are a Facebook or social media user right now, you get advertisements. So basically it's the same model, but applied to the physical infrastructure of your city, right? So according to Alphabet, which is, of course, Google, and Sidewalk Labs, the owner of Intersection, which is one of the 3 major companies in the consortium, the Link NYC kiosks are a commercial solution to bridge the digital divide as part of their integrated platform for urban innovation spanning technology, data, policy best practices, relationships, and capital. And the service is going to be free to the city, so how could you resist that? And in addition, it will generate at least $500 million in revenue for the government over the 12-year contract. Okay, so that's one example. I was going to read you a little bit more to tell you about. So Link NYC is a good example of this idea of the city as a platform. And according to a recent report by the Aspen Institute, people are one of 4 asset classes. So think about people as asset classes, right? Which include data, infrastructure, and technologies. So in essence, in order to make this model financially viable in the city of New York, it's selling the eyeballs of the citizens in exchange for these free services. And the focus of this exchange, of course, is the location-based advertising. And while there is a privacy policy and some information on data rights in these original franchise documents that the city signed with the consortium, people still don't really have enough information. There's a lot of concern about surveillance. There are cameras on these devices. And even though we know companies say that the data is anonymous, that it doesn't prevent them often from combining that with many other databases and still learning way too much about you, right? So that's a serious concern. Okay. So as one of the founder and CEO of Sidewalk Labs, who gave a talk last year, he said that by having access to the browsing activity of people using the Wi-Fi, all anonymized and aggregated, we can actually target ads to people in proximity. Then obviously over time, track them through lots of different things like beacons and location services, as well as their browsing activity. So in effect, what we're doing is replicating the digital experience in physical space. Right? Okay, so another example. So that's just one kind of infrastructure that we need to be thinking about, critiquing, worrying about as we think about urban futures. The next one is these red flex traffic systems. So these are red light cameras. And they are, enforced with a photo. So it says like photo enforced. And here's an example of the ticket that you will get if you run a red light, which has, the pictures that show the evidence that you are guilty of running a red light. Okay, so a little bit about that example. So these red light cameras and smart parking meters and other kinds of traffic management are becoming more common in cities. So an example, last year in July, the city of Chicago agreed to settle a $38.2 $75 million class action lawsuit related to its red light camera program. So under the settlement, the city will repay drivers that were unfairly ticketed a portion of the cost of their ticket. So over the past 5 years, this program, which was implemented to make Chicago's intersections safer, has been mired by both corruption, bribery, mismanagement, malfunction, and moral wrongdoing. And this confluence of factors has resulted in a great deal of negative press about the project, mostly in the Chicago Tribune. And this should not be understood as an exception or an unusual example. Actually, this is business as usual at the intersection of technology and cities and politics, right? So I'm trying to argue often that the failures of technology are not an exception, as maybe engineers would like to say, but actually the norm. So this gives us a new way to think about technological systems. So according to a study which was commissioned by the Chicago Tribune in 2014, the traffic cameras have little effect on safety. In some cases, they've even increased the number of rear-end collisions by 22%. And the reason for that is because people are afraid to drive through the intersection. Instead, they back up into the person behind them and cause an accident. Okay, so I've had this happen myself. I've been riding in a taxi in Chicago, and the taxi driver refused to go through the intersection. Instead, he took me on a very different route so that we wouldn't have to go through that intersection where he knew the red light camera was probably going to give him a ticket. The reason for this was that the federal limit for how long the red light has to stay red or yellow or green was actually not being implemented correctly. So there were engineering failures, there were political failures, there were social failures, there was bribery and corruption, which didn't really help. So it's very problematic. And so one city official has made the claim that rather than safety, the red light camera program has always been about revenue generation for the city as a substitute for taxes. So these controversies surrounding the red light cameras in Chicago make visible the ways in which design and engineering criteria, such as safety and efficiency, seamlessness and stickiness, and convenience and security, are themselves ways of defining the ethics, values, and politics of our cities and citizens. So like wolves in sheep clothing, these specifications seem difficult to argue with at first glance, but a detailed investigation illustrates the ways in which they are in fact embedded in the political economy and more specifically in neoliberal capitalism. So on their website, Redflex, they produce lots of different technologies, and they claim that they make our cities and our lives greener, safer, and smarter. They argue that their technology can reliably and consistently address negative driving behaviors and effectively enforce traffic laws on roadways and intersections with a history of crashes and incidents. But in the case of Chicago, nothing could be further than the truth. Okay. Instead, they were unnecessarily installed in some intersections without a history of problems. They malfunctioned. They issued illegal tickets due to the short yellow lights. And the tickets were issued after enforcement hours. And also due to structural inequalities, we can assume that these difficulties were more likely to negatively impact poorer and less advantaged city residents. Okay. So that's the Redflex example and red light cameras. So both of those are part of that city as platform framing. I'm going to move on now to the city as testbed. This is most evident in the autonomous vehicles research, of course, but there are lots of other projects too that we could potentially link to this framing of the city as testbed. So with this, I'll talk a little bit about the Driverless City project at IIT, which was funded by the NIAR Prize in the inaugural year. And you can see the collaborators there on the project. And one of the things that we did to make sense of all of the different socio-technical issues that were at play in this topic was to create a mind map of 4 specific topics: delivery space, mobility space, and that was actually printed in the New York Times last fall. And it's a great example of how we can use design and visualization as a way of making sense of the world, and also illustrating that to connect to the broader public, right? So I could write an academic article about this, but it's much more impactful to do it through a visualization. It allows more people to potentially get involved in the topic, right? And this project was also presented last year as part of an exhibit in Vienna as part of the Vienna Biennale. Here is the full map. And this, you can see parking space, commuter space, street space, and delivery space were the topics. And I'll show you a video for one of those. I just wanted to shout out another project which is related here. And this one, this one has recently been completed and is on exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's called The Anatomy of an AI System by Kate Crawford and her collaborator, and it was just recently released a few days ago. And this one actually looks at the Amazon Echo and all of the labor and materials that are required to build the Amazon Echo, which is an in-home device. So I just think that that's a nice example because the two projects together illustrate the ways in which design can be used to help us understand the socio-technical complexity of emerging technologies. So here I'll read to you a bit of the material from the Driverless City project. And this is, well, I'll explain it in a minute. Head north on Route 75 towards Flint, said the scratch green sign. We stopped carefully at the flashing red light in our rented black Chevy Tahoe SUV and then proceeded on a ramp towards Grand River Drive on Route 5 through a tunnel. We turned slowly to the left, taking note of the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, past a canopy of trees, and went over a short, narrow bridge. Now, just past the traffic signals at the railroad crossing in the intersection, we could see the colorful facades of familiar stores from a small town in the Midwest emerging in the distance. The adjacent sidewalk was dotted with garbage cans, mailboxes, benches, streetlights, fire hydrants, and parking meters. A painted bike lane curved along the right side of the street along the curb. We turned right onto Wolverine Ave and down State Street and headed toward Pontiac Terrace. Somehow we were right back where we started. We could have driven around all day in an infinite loop, but never arrived anywhere at all, and certainly not any closer to the future of the city. So this is an image of the University of Michigan testbed, which we had the good fortune to visit about 2 years ago. And this test facility, it was opened in July 2015, and it's a 32-acre site with 5 miles of track, and it's oriented north-south in order to test geographic positioning systems, GPS. The site is used by the university and industry researchers to test wireless communication systems that are necessary for autonomous vehicles to communicate with the transportation infrastructure in complex real-world scenarios. So on the one hand, the M-City, the only facility of its type in the world, is a safe, secure, controlled, and repeatable environment. And on the other hand, it is in the real world. The traffic signs have been donated and deliberately scratched in order to test the accuracy of the image processing systems. The tree canopy is actually a metal frame structure covered with a piece of black fabric in order to simulate the interference that trees can cause in the transmission of wireless signals. It is even possible to simulate humidity in the natural environment and its impact on the communication systems. The building facades and other aspects of the test facility are all made with real materials such as glass, brick, wood, aluminum, and vinyl. A digitally printed, stylized image of Zingerman's Deli from Ann Arbor is integrated into the facade, which depicts a densely populated business district with multiple local shops side by side. The building facades, and only the facades have been simulated, give the strip the feeling of a Western frontier town. While the road itself is designed to scale, many of the components, such as bridges, tunnels, and intersections, are smaller and shorter. So that's gives you a sense of what it was like to drive around this test bed. It's actually very small, but of course in my narrative and experience of it with the signs and the bridges and the tunnels, it almost feels a lot bigger. And it's this combination of real world and kind of imagined test bed that I wanted to highlight here. And this is one of the interventions that was designed by some of my colleagues on the team who are urban planners, including Ron Henderson. And this depicts a dynamic use of space, so spaces that could be dynamically shifted from used by vehicles to used by humans, because you can communicate with the infrastructure, you could potentially adapt it and use it in a more dynamic way. So now I'll show a film from the Driverless City project. It's one of 4 speculative videos, which you can watch on the Driverless City website for this project, to give you a sense of, again, that speculative, now hopefully I can find the, try it again.
By 2036, pockets of Chicago centers Naperville and Joliet had become so congested with last-mile delivery vehicles that aerial drones began replacing autonomous vehicle delivery, thus reducing the need for the sprawling warehousing and distribution centers that populated the Chicago metropolitan area throughout the 20th century. Class 1 railroads, originally the key to Chicago's role as a center of manufacturing and distribution, have been largely superseded by platoons of autonomous trucks and truck trains up to several miles in length. The North American Land Bridge, running from Los Angeles to New York via Chicago, is the last remaining profitable railroad that hasn't transformed into a development company. It is owned and operated by UP-CSX, a merger of the Union Pacific and CSX railroads. To maintain profitability, double-stack container trains traveling in the corridor reach up to 3 miles in length. Former trackage, their rights-of-way and intermodal freight facilities are still owned by BNSF, CN, and other companies, but now they lie fallow, serving as ad hoc nature preserves and wildlife corridors, as nature reclaims the formerly active transportation corridors. Platooning vans disperse regionally to irrigate markets with fresh produce. At the same time, electronics, furniture, and even autonomous vehicles produced through the vast global supply chain are also ubiquitous. The need for social connection and the demand for hyper-specialized goods has assured the viability of in-place retailing throughout the region. Purchases made in person can be located and transferred from a truck house and delivered within minutes or hours to any location. Persistent trade imbalances with China and Southeast Asia have led to networked markets for recycling. UP-CSX fills empty containers with waste products for return trips. The consequent closing of landfills has therefore become a significant planning challenge for public authorities hoping to recoup some value from those sites. With the ability to detect potential collisions, including wildlife, from long distances, roadkill has become largely a thing of the past, thus contributing to overpopulation of certain species. In response to homeowners' complaints about deer, coyotes, and other large mammals, the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana relaxed regulation and opened new areas of hunting throughout the territory. Many former drivers and warehouse workers have developed seasonal hunting and trapping services. They supply on-demand food with fresh meats, catering to the public's appetite for regionally specific foods. The popularity of locally sourced cuisine contrasted greatly with the nearly complete outsourcing of most other forms of production. The vast tracts of warehouses abandoned by industrial property developers and third-party logistics companies have also proven to be fertile ground for many gray market industries. These vast landscapes of exchange, born in the 19th century, had served their purpose and now needed a new role to play in the 21st century. Once separated from our cities and hidden from view, they became testing grounds for new forms of production and civic life.
Okay, so again, this project, the purpose of a video like this, which is speculative in nature, is not only to critique, but also to kind of play with the generative potential So the whole idea here being, if architects and designers can contribute to helping the city, kind of reimagine what these technologies might be for, we might be able to achieve different kind of designs for the city. But if you look at some of the typical framings around autonomous vehicles, you see things like this, Project Nighttonomy from Ford, which is something you can watch on YouTube. And this is actually shot in the aesthetic of essentially kind of a military video. Think about like a movie that's sort of a war or military kind of movie, like The Hurt Locker, for example, and it has that very much that aesthetic. And in this, when you're watching it, the advertisement here for the 2016 Ford Fusion continually drops down as you're watching the advertisement. And so here, this is really a way in which the future is constantly used to sell us the present. They're selling us a car that is not capable of driving at night by itself, but this is like helping us to, get on board or to familiarize ourselves with the kinds of futures that want to be presented by the auto industry, right? So there, I'll move on to the city as laboratory framing, and this is really more around the environmental sensing networks and the Internet of Things. The previous CIO of Chicago, Brenna Berman, talked about it as the Fitbit for the city. This project is called the Array of Things, which has been deployed to a limited extent so far, but it was actually designed through a partnership between the Art Institute, or a faculty member at the Art Institute, along with the Array of Things project. So they paid a lot of attention to the design of the actual devices. And so far, from what I've been able to gather, there are only a small handful of nodes deployed, and there are a number of problems, of course, with urban sensing projects related to where they're placed and what you're trying to measure. That's out of place, sorry. But I just wanted to alert your attention to that idea of the city as a lab where we're gathering data and studying it, for example, environmental sensing of pollution data. So with that, I'm going to move on to the fourth argument here, which is around the city as a new urban factory. And we see examples of this, I think, both in Chicago and New York, as well as around the country. This idea that we can bring certain kinds of manufacturing back into the city center because manufacturing is no longer as polluting as it once was, and so certain kinds of activities are being promoted. So there's two examples. So Chicago, there's a new federally funded initiative called UI Labs that's working very much on digital manufacturing, which in essence means a number of things, but essentially working with companies that provide digital technologies to support assembly lines and workers, and using data to transfer design files both from the clients to the manufacturers. And so it's about that whole conversation. It's also part of what is often referred to as the fourth industrial revolution by the World Economic Forum. And something that we can certainly critique a lot of those claims as well. So the other site is one called MHub. And here is a video of the MHub launch, which was about a year ago. I'll fast forward a little bit. Here, the sound is not so important, so I'll just fast forward it and see. So basically, this is the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, and this is the ribbon cutting ceremony, but instead of ribbon cutting, it was sort of metal soldering. And this was their launch event. So I thought it would be fun for you all to see that. And you can see that you can see that the soldering is happening, and so MHub is a digital fabrication space. They have a wide variety of equipment, and they're trying to build up, their membership with partnerships with local companies. And I visited several times in the last year to try to understand who the membership is, how is it serving the broader Chicago community, and what are the kind of claims embedded in that space. The next slide, this is of a press conference that was held last summer in Milan, Italy. So you see the mayor of Milan and the mayor of Chicago sitting next to each other, along with the deans of the dean of the Milano Polytechnic School of Design, Luisa Collina, and Dennis Weil, our dean at ID, and then our previous provost, Francis Burnett. And this event was held as part of a partnership between the two schools, which launched a project called Made in Chicago, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. So as part of this ongoing research into this, how the city is being reimagined as a new urban factory, I attended an event which was called the Fourth Industrial Revolution Award Ceremony, and this video will show you actually a drone that is going to fly to the stage, which again, the audio here is not very important, but you can see the drone. And the drone is dropping off the award. So it's a large banquet hall.
The drone sounded angry there on that last.
Yeah. So there, it's a it's a large banquet hall, and it's almost like the scene from a wedding. It really resembles a wedding, but instead of a happy couple, it's the future of manufacturing in the city, where a tiding tide lifts all ships, is one of the quotes, is being celebrated along with a dozen initiatives, including a robotics project on the south side and a number of small and large companies. And the governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, at the time, he is a former venture capitalist, and he made a brief appearance and proclaimed that entrepreneurship is what the American economy is all about. And being an entrepreneur is what it means to be American. So, yeah. So this gives you a sense of, from the M-Hub, some of the reading material that's there, so Making in America. And, I think there are many different ways to read these narratives, right? I mean, one might be about, the return to kind of artisanal face-to-face and local manufacturing. Another way to read it is, of course, more conservative and provincial and sort of, we should make things only in Chicago or only in the US. And I think it has that deeply conservative part of that argument as well. And so that's something as scholars and designers that we need to be thinking about. And this is a picture from a visit to a high school on the west side of Chicago, so a very more disadvantaged area, and they're making their digital manufacturing shop. So you can see, of course, the distinct difference between the M-Hub space and the sort of high school shop. And, in this research, what we found is that Chicago is a very small and intimately connected city. So everybody knows each other. It's a common feeling that people say, oh, we all know each other, but it's also very divided and very disconnected. And so we found that to be a very interesting conflict or friction, right? So on the one hand, a lot of the making community and the designers and the entrepreneurs and people who are involved with M-Hub and UI Labs and these other sites, they feel that it's a close-knit community. On the other hand, when we interviewed some of the social and economic justice organizations and some of the high schools that were trying to get youth, especially youth of color, to be trained in some kind of digital fabrication skills and credentials because they feel that there's still some good jobs available, that they were very disconnected from those networks. So I think that was one of the biggest learnings for us in some of the interviews that we did. We did about 16 interviews in the last last couple of months and just found that really parallel, that there's a lot of support for certain kinds of entrepreneurship and innovation, but yet it's not inclusive. And so we wrote a report called Making Diverse Economies to go into more of those details and try to understand the context better. And so moving on then to the New York case, here I showed you that Hudson Yards project there, which was like a new luxury development. Well, it happens to be right next to the garment district. And so in some sense, the garment district is being reshaped and in some sense pushed out because of the new smart city development of Hudson Yards, which also hopes to take advantage of many technologies and test new technologies. So just to show you that both in New York and in Chicago, there are these narratives around cultivating new urban manufacturing. Okay, so I think I'm getting close, very close to the end. So I just wanted to leave you with a few conclusions about some of this research and some of these framings. So in thinking about emerging technologies in particular, it's very easy to say that the smart city is this kind of universal, rational technology kind of being deployed everywhere and, surveilling and turning data into profit. But I think we have to think about the ways in which both top-down and bottom-up approaches contribute to this patchwork. So, is the smart city kind of a feature creep? Like we adopt one technology and then we get the next and the next and the next, and then we just can't resist it. And like, for example, we want luxury real estate, and then we also get surveillance systems, right? Or, and thinking about the ways in which the future is really being used here to sell us the present. And the present is very unequal in that we have not paid attention to, issues around social and economic justice, for example, people of disability in the driverless car example, people of color, right? So in any case, it's really about thinking about the final kind of questions here that I want to pose is, how can we resist the smart city and remake it for citizens? What new imaginaries are needed? And how can design play a role in crafting these imaginaries? And so that I'll just show, there's lots of places where you can read more about these topics, and I'm eager to discuss with you as well. And thanks again for the kind invitation to share this work with you.